What happens when power meets humility at 30,000 feet? This is the extraordinary moment when Keanu Reeves witnessed something so unfair, so cruel, that he couldn't just sit back and watch. It started as just another flight. Passengers settling into their seats, flight attendants moving efficiently through the aisles, and the quiet hum of the aircraft filling the cabin. Keanu, known for his down-to-earth nature despite his fame, had chosen a window seat, hoping for a peaceful journey. Dressed simply in a black hoodie and jeans, he blended in effortlessly with the other travelers. He pulled out a book, trying to relax, unaware that within moments something would demand his attention. Pulse, subscribe to our channel and tell me in comments from where are you watching this video. A frail elderly woman, her hands trembling slightly, made her way down the aisle, looking for her seat. Her movements were slow, careful, as if she was afraid of inconveniencing anyone. But as she reached her assigned row, a problem arose. The seat next to hers was occupied by a younger man, headphones in, feet stretched into the limited leg space. Without a word, she gestured, trying to get his attention. He barely glanced at her before sighing dramatically and moving just enough for her to squeeze past. Just as she was about to settle in, a flight attendant with a sharp, impatient expression appeared. Her name tag read, Jessica. She was tall, with a tight bun and a demeanor that screamed efficiency, but not kindness. She looked down at the elderly woman, her eyes narrowing. "Ma'am, this isn't your seat," Jessica said, her tone clipped. The old woman's eyes widened in confusion. She fumbled for her boarding pass, her fingers shaking as she tried to read the small print. Jessica didn't wait. She plucked the ticket from the woman's hand, barely glancing at it before shaking her head. "You're in the wrong row. You need to move." I thought this was..." The woman's voice was barely above a whisper. Jessica let out a sharp breath, as if patience was a luxury she couldn't afford. "You're in business class," she said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Some turned their heads, curious. Others smirked. "Your seat is in economy, all the way back. You need to move now." The woman's face flushed with embarrassment. She looked around, unsure of what to do. I must have made a mistake," she murmured, struggling to get up. Her frail frame made the process painfully slow. Keanu had been quietly observing the entire exchange, his book forgotten in his lap. His jaw tightened as he saw the way the flight attendant spoke to the woman, as if she was nothing more than an inconvenience. He watched as the elderly woman tried to gather her few belongings, her fingers shaking so much that her small purse slipped from her lap and fell to the floor, spilling its contents. The flight attendant didn't move to help. Instead, she looked around as if expecting someone else to step in. The younger man beside the elderly woman rolled his eyes and shifted further away. No one moved. No one spoke. Keanu had seen enough. In one smooth motion, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. His presence was commanding without being loud, his calm energy instantly shifting the tension in the air. He bent down, carefully picking up the woman's purse and handing it back to her with a gentle smile. "Here you go, ma'am," he said softly. The elderly woman looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude but also lingering embarrassment. "Thank you," she whispered. But Keanu wasn't done. He turned to Jessica, his expression unreadable. "What's the issue here?" His voice was polite, but there was an unmistakable firmness behind it. Jessica straightened, clearly recognizing him now. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, but she quickly masked it with her usual professionalism. "She's in the wrong seat," she said, but this time her tone wasn't as sharp. "She needs to move to economy." Keanu tilted his head slightly, glancing at the woman's boarding pass still clutched in Jessica's hand. "May I see that?" he asked, extending his hand. Jessica hesitated, then handed it over. Keanu scanned the ticket and frowned. "You're right," he said after a beat. "This seat isn't hers." Jessica nodded, satisfied. "Exactly. So if she could just..." "But," Keanu interrupted, his voice calm but firm, "that's not her fault, is it? Jessica blinked. Excuse me? This isn't about a seat. It's about how you treat people, Keanu continued. You humiliated her in front of everyone instead of simply helping her. He gestured towards the back of the plane. She made a mistake, and instead of being kind, you embarrassed her. Passengers were now fully paying attention. Some murmured in agreement. Jessica's face turned red, but she didn't argue. Keanu turned back to the elderly woman and smiled. Would you like to sit here, ma'am? She looked startled. Oh, but this is my seat. Keanu finished for her. And I'd love for you to have it. Jessica's mouth opened, then closed. She clearly wanted to protest, but she couldn't argue with a first-class passenger giving up his own seat. The elderly woman's lips trembled, overwhelmed. I can't accept that. Keanu gave her a reassuring smile. Please. It would be my honor. The entire plane was silent, the weight of the moment sinking in. Jessica, defeated, mumbled something under her breath and walked away. The younger man beside the elderly woman finally looked guilty and moved to help her settle in properly. Keanu quietly gathered his belongings, giving the woman's hand a gentle squeeze before heading toward the back of the plane. But what happened next was something no one saw coming. As Keanu made his way to the back of the plane, the air felt different. People were whispering, some nodding in approval, while others looked away, perhaps ashamed that they hadn't spoken up themselves. But Keanu wasn't thinking about them. His mind was on the elderly woman, now sitting in his seat, her hands still trembling slightly. A flight attendant, different from the one before, approached him near the economy section. Mr. Reeves, we can arrange something more comfortable for you, she offered politely. Keanu smiled. This is perfect, he said, sliding into an empty seat beside a nervous-looking teenager. The boy blinked in shock, clearly recognizing him, but too stunned to say anything. Keanu simply gave him a nod and settled in. Back in business class, the elderly woman was still overwhelmed. She ran her fingers over the smooth armrest, glancing around as if expecting someone to tell her it was all a mistake. Her eyes landed on Jessica, who stood stiffly nearby, her expression unreadable. A few moments later, as drinks were being served, Keanu stood up and made his way back to her. He crouched down beside her seat so he was at eye level. Comfortable? He asked with a warm smile. She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. I don't belong here. Keanu tilted his head. Why not? She hesitated. Because people like me, we don't sit in seats like this. He chuckled, shaking his head. Seats don't decide who belongs. People do. She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes welling up. You're very kind, she whispered. Keanu shrugged lightly. My mother always said, how you treat someone who has nothing to offer you says everything about you. He let that sink in before gently changing the subject. Where are you traveling to? She smiled at the question, a far-off look in her eyes. Home. My son lives there. I haven't seen him in years. Keanu's face softened. He must be excited to see you. She swallowed. I hope so. We didn't part on the best terms. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her cardigan. Time passed, and I suppose pride got in the way. Keanu nodded, understanding. Sometimes all it takes is one moment of courage to fix things. She looked down, processing his words. Then, for the first time in a long while, she smiled, really smiled. Meanwhile, Jessica stood a few feet away, watching. She had been silent, absorbing everything. For the first time, she saw her own actions from a different angle. The way she had spoken to the woman, the way she had dismissed her. It all played back in her mind like a scene from a bad movie. Later, as the flight neared its destination, Jessica hesitated before stepping toward Keanu. Mr. Reeves, she started, her voice quieter than before. He looked up. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was just doing my job. Keanu studied her for a moment, then nodded. I believe you, he said simply. But the thing about jobs? They don't define who we are. How we treat people does. Jessica swallowed hard, nodding slightly before walking away, lost in thought. As the plane landed, the elderly woman turned to Keanu one last time. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with something new. Hope. Keanu smiled. Have a great reunion. She pressed a wrinkled hand over his. Because of you. I think I will. As Keanu walked off the plane, he didn't need applause or recognition. He had done what he always did. He chose kindness. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below. What's the kindest thing someone has ever done for you? Subscribe for more heartwarming stories.